Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today I'm going to be doing the rotation guide for Machinist. Now Machinist is the last range that we're going to be looking at, and it's also the only one that doesn't have RNG involved in their gameplay. So as I said before, Dancer is super RNG, so if you like having your gameplay change every time that you play it, Dancer is probably for you. Bard is more a set rotation, but still very proc heavy, so you still have some RNG in the rotation. And then Machinist, that's just completely no RNG, straightforward, you know what you're going to get. Now, Machinist works around a bunch of different resources, really, both tied to separate cooldowns, tied to GCDs that are on a separate cooldown as well, like your drill and your air anchor are those special GCDs that have their own cooldown. And then you also have a heat mechanic, a battery gauge, and Wildfire. So all of these things combined make it so that you're actually going to be paying attention to a lot of different stuff for Machinist. And it also makes it so that you can actually pull resources into burst windows quite a lot, like you can with Dancer and your feathers, for example. So first of all, let's talk about each individual mechanic, and then I'll kind of talk about how you can kind of use them to pull resources for certain burst windows. So first of all, air anchor and drill. These are your two special GCDs. They're also very high hitting GCDs because they're the strongest abilities that you have basically. So basically always use these on cooldown. General rule of thumb, when you use a GCD and you see that you have 3 seconds left on either drill or air anchor, then that is going to be your next GCD. So if you have 4 or more seconds on it, use another GCD, but when you press the GCD and you see that you just have like 3 seconds left on them, that should be your next GCD in general. Together with that, we also have a skill called reassemble. This will make it so that your next GCD is going to do a critical direct hit, meaning that we always want to be using this on either drill or air anchor. The way the rotation flows, we're basically always going to be using this on drill, because air anchor has a bit of a weird cooldown, but it will always align with drill regardless, because drill has a 20-second recast time, meaning that with skill speed it's 19 seconds and a bit, and our reassemble is 55 seconds, so reassemble should always come up a few seconds before your drill is ready, so just hold on to it a few seconds before executing that drill. So those are our special GCDs. Now let's talk about the battery gauge. The battery gauge is only used to summon our auto turret. Before level 80 it's the Rook auto turret. At level 80 it transforms into the Automaton Queen. It's a really cool robot that Machinist has, and it basically acts like a normal melee player. So when you summon your queen, all of the buffs that are on the party and also on the boss, like the debuffs, stuff like trick attack, chain stratagem, that kind of stuff, will also affect your queen. Now, the reason why queen is a bit special is because she doesn't snapshot the buffs. So it's not like with Bard, where if you clip your dots into buffs, your dots are going to be like ticking for the next 30 seconds as if those buffs were still there. No, the Automaton Queen executes her attacks and they're basically registered as normal GCDs as a player, meaning that if you summon her after, for example, something like Battle Voice or Battle Litany goes out, your queen won't get those buffs magically because you already have them. On the other hand, if your queen is summoned when those buffs go out, she will get the buffs as well. And for example, say a trick attack gets applied by the time that your queen is already hitting the boss, the next GCDs that your queen will execute will be influenced by that trick attack. So for that reason, we're basically always going to be summoning our queen a little bit earlier before the raid buffs go out, because not only can we then actually make use of the raid buffs because she's there and she gains them, but also because of the fact that she has a little bit of a summoning animation and she doesn't really execute actions until like 5 seconds into her summoning rotation. Now, another thing with that, the battery gauge basically is a linear like damage per gauge spent kind of thing. So it doesn't matter if you summon her queen at 50 gauge or at the 100 gauge, the damage that she'll do comparatively to your battery gauge will always stay the same. So in other words, you always want to summon her right before your personal burst, which is every 2 minutes, and then at every 1 minute, if you have something like a ninja, you want to be summoning her as well. So in the little thing that I'm showing in the background right now, I've basically gone off the idea that I have a ninja or I have 1 minute buffs, or even 3 minute buffs, because like 3 minutes doesn't align with your personal 2 minutes. So that's why my queen is always going to be summoned a little bit earlier than those 3 minute buffs. The reason, or the way how I keep track of those 1 minute buff rotations, I guess you could say, is because of my Wildfire. Wildfire is a 2-minute cooldown, meaning that by the time your Wildfire has 60 seconds left on the clock, you know that there should be those 1-minute buffs going out. And then of course, after your second Wildfire, that's where your 3-minute buffs will go out and stuff like that. So that's a battery gauge, only used for a queen, but there's a little bit of optimization that you can do there to make her hit a little bit harder. Now, last but not least, we have our Wildfire as well as our heat gauge, which is tied to Hypercharge. So Wildfire works very differently now than it did back in the day. Back in Stormblood and Heavensward, your Wildfire would basically place a buff on the boss, and then it would take a portion of the damage that you dealt in that Wildfire window and then amplify that damage into a final hit, which was the Wildfire Explosion. Now, currently Wildfire works that basically it will deal damage depending on how many GCDs were executed when Wildfire was on the boss. So it doesn't care about all of the oGCDs, it doesn't care about crit, direct hit, RNG, that kind of stuff. It only cares about GCDs. So there's two ways that we can go about getting 6 GCDs inside of our Wildfire, because that's basically what we're trying to do. First thing that you can do is you can double weave Wildfire and Hypercharge. I'll talk about Hypercharge in just a second, because that way we'll get 5 heat blasts into our Wildfire and 1 random GCD. Or on the other hand, we can do Hypercharge first, which is what I'll be showing in this video, and then after we use our first heat blast, that's when we're going to be using our Wildfire, because then we can get 4 heat blasts and 2 normal GCDs inside of the Wildfire. So as long as you can get 6 GCDs in, it's fine. So you can use either of these two, Wildfire Hypercharge double weave, or use Wildfire after your first heat blast from your Hypercharge. Now let's quickly talk about Hypercharge then, because it's very important for your Wildfire and also the setup to pool resources into those 3-minute buffs that we talked about before. So the way Hypercharge works is you need 50 heat gauge to execute it. You gain heat gauge from a few different resources, which I'll talk about in just a second. But when you execute Hypercharge, you get access to 2 new actions, Heat Blast and Auto Crossbow. Auto Crossbow is basically only for AoE, Heat Blast is for your single target, and this is tied together with Ricochet and Gauss Round. So Ricochet, Gauss Round are your 2 oGCDs. They can stack up to 3 times, but you basically don't want to have them stacked at 3 times, because then of course you're going to be losing damage. But the way it works is every time you execute Heat Blast, you're going to be reducing the cooldown of both Ricochet and Gauss Round by 15 seconds. So in other words, say you have 1 stack of each, you execute Hypercharge and you start spamming that Heat Blast, you're always going to be alternating Ricochet and Gauss Round every GCD. So it's like Heat Blast Ricochet, Heat Blast Gauss Round, Heat Blast Ricochet, Heat Blast Gauss Round, until you're out of Heat Blasts, basically. So the reason why we're only going to be using 1 oGCD is because Heat Blast is a 1.5 second GCD. This does not stack with skill speed, so it's always 1.5 seconds. And this means that basically this allows us to get our 6 GCDs under that Wildfire window, because our GCD is going so very fast. Because of this, you want to dump your Gauss Round and Ricochet stacks before you execute, before you go into Hypercharge, because otherwise you're going to be overcapping maybe here or there, which I accidentally do in this video. But on the other hand, we can't always use our Hypercharge underneath something like a trick, which you'll see as well. And basically what we can do though is not use all of our charges of Gauss Round and Ricochet and pull those over into that trick attack window. Now, and the thing that you're seeing in the background, I'm not always doing this. Here and there I will do, because I'm paying attention to it. I was more looking towards the queen. But in general, you could technically keep those stacks for a trick attack window or something like that, to pull some extra resources. Now, of course, if you're just trying to play Machinist from like as a general gameplay perspective, then just spam your Gauss Round and your Ricochet as they come up. It's not a huge damage loss. But if you do try to optimize it a little bit, then using them under stuff like trick attack or at 3 minutes underneath that burst as well, will see you quite a nice damage increase. Now, to get our heat gauge, as I said, there's a few different ways to get it. First of all, we have a 1-2-3 combo, which are our heated shots, I guess we'll call them. Each of these will generate 5 heat, and then the final one will also generate 10 battery gauge. Your 2 special GCDs, your air anchor and your drill, do not generate heat, but air anchor will generate 20 battery gauge, so keep that in mind as well, so you don't overcap that gauge. Last but not least, we also have barrel stabilizer. This is something that we can use to get a 50 heat immediately. Now, because barrel stabilizer is 2 minutes, Wildfire is 2 minutes, you can say, oh, I always want to be using barrel stabilizer before the Wildfire, so that I have enough heat to go into the Wildfire, because I then want to have my Hypercharge ready. Well, that's a very good way of thinking, but the problem is that it doesn't actually work out that way. So we're basically going to be generating too much heat over the course of 2 minutes for us to not overcap heat by using barrel stabilizer before the Wildfire. So in our opener, we're obviously going to be doing this, because otherwise there's no way for us to get 50 heat in a very short window. But past the opener, we're always going to be using barrel stabilizer at some point after the Wildfire, because otherwise we're basically just going to be overcapping our heat, and that's something that we don't want to do. As long as you don't lose out on the usage of barrel stabilizer, always use it after your Wildfire is done, so that we're basically just not overcapping heat, because that would be a loss in potential DPS, as it could eventually over the course of a fight make it so that we get a Hypercharge less, and that's not so good. So with all of that being said, that's pretty much the theory behind Machinist. Let's now jump into the actual dummy, and I'll show you how it works in practice. So as always, the opener will be on top of the screen. Now very quickly, if you want to use a potion, you're basically going to be using it pre-pull after you use your reassemble, because we're going to be using reassemble 5 seconds before the countdown actually happens. So in between you press reassemble and then you start in the fight, that's basically where you would use your potion. And then, as I said, we're going to be using the Wildfire during the Hypercharge, because that will make it line up quite nicely. And then we're going to spend the rest of our Ricochet and Gauss rounds. Now, for now, we're basically just going to be making sure that we press our 2 special GCDs on cooldown, which I have here neatly at the top left, so it's easy for me to keep track of them. Now also, if you want to use your Hypercharge during the rotation, you basically always want to make sure that you don't have to press 3 GCDs, so to speak, in between, so you don't basically break your combo, so to speak. So if you have to use both of your special GCDs before and after the Wildfire or something like that, then you're basically going to be breaking your combo. Now, as for when you can go into that Wildfire or go into that Hypercharge, basically as long as there is 8 or more seconds left on these 2 special GCDs, you can go into your Hypercharge. Basically just say as long as there's 10 or more seconds, that's when you can go. Now this is where we had 1 minute, so that's why I used my Queen a little bit earlier, right before I hit 100 gauge. I could have technically kept stacks of both Ricochet and Gauss round if I wanted to do some extra damage, if there was something like a ninja, because if you don't have a ninja, you're not going to have raid buffs there. But if you do have a ninja, then you could totally use your burst there. Now, for now, we're basically just going to be spending our 2 stacks again, and we're going to save our heat gauge, because our Wildfire is about to come up again, and we basically want to have our gauge for that Wildfire. Use reassemble on our drill. Then of course we're going to be using our Automaton Queen as well, because raid buffs should come up around here. And then we go into our Hypercharge, Wildfire, and then we spend our oGCDs. And then as soon as we're done, we can use our barrel stabilizer to get our heat back, and then we can go into another Hypercharge if you want to, or you can save it for later. I mostly just like using it straight away. And then I'll build up to our next Wildfire, so that you can kind of see the 4-minute rotation, and there shall be that. In general, you're always going to be having 2 GCDs in between your drill and your this thing, your air anchor, about 20 seconds away from raid buff. So here I'll try and save a little bit more of the stacks, so I'm going to be spending 1 stack in each. No, actually no, I need to spend 2. There we go, and now we have 2 stacks saved up for when that 60-second raid buff window happens, which is now. So now we can spend those stacks as well as our automaton queen. And then this is pretty much like, this should be where the 3-minute raid buffs would be. And then here we can just dump because we don't have any raid buffs coming up before our next Wildfire. So we might as well just dump our gauge here. Now, since you generate a little bit less than 50 gauge per half a minute when it comes to your heat gauge, we're going to be spending another Hypercharge here, because we're going to be getting enough heat back for the next Hypercharge, or for the next Wildfire rather. We wouldn't be generating enough heat to do another Wildfire in between another Hypercharge in between our Wildfires. So right here, we're gonna dump this. We just got to 50 gauge, and then we go into the next Wildfire. And that's pretty much that. This repeats itself for the most part. The only difference that you're going to be seeing here and there is your heat gauge. Your heat gauge is going to fluctuate a little bit here and there because you do not generate a beautiful round number every like 2 minutes, so to speak. So that's why your heat gauge is going to look a little bit different every single time. But in general, this is kind of like the flow. Save up enough heat gauge just in case for your Wildfire. If you're new to Machinist and you're kind of learning how to play it, getting used to the burst windows, save a little bit too many gauge. It's not too bad to overcap your gauge. It's worse to not use your Wildfire on cooldown. So as long as you're getting used to it, save enough gauge. Once you're used to it and you know how much gauge you're going to be generating, more or less, every 60 seconds, then you can spend an extra Hypercharge or something like that. Because a little bit of lost heat is not as bad as losing your Wildfire underneath those raid buffs. So yeah, that's pretty much Machinist. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.